The rumble of my suitcase wheels on the pavement was the only sound breaking the evening stillness as I approached the airbeam. The job interview looming in my mind was big. Life, changing big. So I had chosen a place in a quiet neighborhood, thinking it would be peaceful, a good spot to collect my thoughts. From the outside, the house looked normal, almost inviting, with its soft porch light and neatly trimmed hedges. But the moment I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, a wave of unease washed over me. It wasn't anything obvious. The house was clean, well furnished. Yet it felt lived. There were personal items scattered about. A half-full coffee mug on the table, a novel bent open face, down on the couch, and a pair of women's shoes by the door. It was as if I'd walked into someone's interrupted life. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the jitters about tomorrow. Maybe the host or a previous guest had forgotten to clear their stuff. I wandered through the house, my footsteps echoing slightly, taking in the family photos hanging on the walls, the slightly disheveled throws on the couch. Everywhere I looked, there were little signs of someone else's presence. I tried to settle in, unpacking my suitcase and setting up my interview materials on the dining table. But that feeling of intrusion, of not being alone, clung to me. I couldn't concentrate. Every creak and sigh of the house put me on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half, expecting to see someone else there. As night fell, the house grew quieter, yet every small noise seemed amplified. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just an old house with its quirks. I just needed a good night's sleep, and everything would seem better in the morning. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. The shadows seemed to shift and play tricks on my eyes. I kept hearing soft sounds, like whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with strange, unsettling dreams. I woke up several times, my heart racing, sure that I'd heard a voice or a footstep. But each time, the house was silent. Nothing amiss. By morning, I was a bundle of nerves. I tried to focus on my interview, telling myself that everything would be fine. But deep down, that unsettling feeling from the night before lingered, a persistent whisper in the back of my mind. The morning sun did little to dispel the eerie feeling that had settled over me. I prepared for my interview, trying to focus on the potential life-changing opportunity ahead. But the peculiar sense of intrusion from last night lingered. As I was finishing breakfast, I heard a sound that froze me in place. The creak of a floorboard from upstairs. My heart pounded. I wasn't alone. Tiptoeing towards the stairs, I contemplated whether to confront the intruder or quietly leave. But then she appeared. Descending the stairs was a woman, maybe in her early 30s. She had an effortless beauty, with her hair cascading over her shoulders in loose waves. She smiled at me. "Oh, you must be Alex." "I'm Eva," she said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Her presence was disarming, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of wrongness. "I didn't realize anyone else would be here," I said, my voice tinged with confusion. Eva just laughed, a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet house. I like to keep to myself, usually upstairs. "I hope I didn't startle you." Her demeanor was friendly, almost flirtatious, but something felt off. I tried to engage her in conversation, hoping to understand why she was here, but she skillfully deflected my questions, always steering the conversation back to me. The more we talked, the more unsettled I became. Her questions were probing, almost intrusive, and her gaze was too intense, like she was studying me. I excused myself, saying I needed to get ready for my interview. But her eyes followed me, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Once in the safety of my room, I called the host. His response was immediate and laced with confusion. "No, there should be no one else staying there. Are you sure you saw someone?" His words sent a chill down my spine. Eva wasn't supposed to be here. The house was meant to be mine alone for the stay. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was she? And why was she here? I considered leaving, but the importance of the interview anchored me. I couldn't afford to find another place on such short notice. I decided to stay, to attend the interview, and then figure out what to do about Eva. As I left for the interview, I couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes on me, watching from a window. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken threat. The normalcy of the neighborhood outside felt like a stark contrast to the uncertainty I was leaving behind in that house. Eva's presence, unexplained and unwanted, had turned what should have been a simple stay into something sinister. I couldn't help but wonder what her intentions were and why she was so interested in me. Returning from the interview, the house seemed to loom over me, its windows like watchful eyes. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that Eva was just a quirky housemate, nothing more. But the unease from before was now a palpable dread. That night, the house felt even more oppressive. Strange sounds echoed through the halls, soft thuds, creaking floors, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. I told myself it was just the house settling, but it felt like something more, something deliberate. Eva's presence grew more unsettling. She seemed to appear and disappear at will, her behavior increasingly erratic. One moment she was overly friendly, smiling and chatting as if we were old friends. The next, she was distant, her eyes cold and calculating. I felt trapped. The thought of staying another night filled me with dread, but the importance of the interview process kept me anchored. I couldn't leave. Not yet. I decided to confront Eva, to demand answers about who she was and why she was here. But when I tried, my resolve crumbled. There was something about her, an intensity that made my words catch in my throat. She brushed off my questions with a laugh, her gaze unsettlingly sharp. "You worry too much, Alex," she said, her voice light but her eyes dark. Sleep was elusive that night. Every sound jolted me awake, heart racing. I was sure I heard footsteps outside my door, a shadow flitting past the crack under the door. The house felt alive, watching, waiting. The next day was a blur of interviews and meetings, but my mind was elsewhere, fixated on the house and Eva. When I finally returned, the tension was unbearable. The house was silent, too silent, as if holding its breath. And then I saw him, a man, standing in the shadows of the hallway. My blood ran cold. Eva introduced him casually as Jake, but his presence sent alarm bells ringing in my head. There was something menacing about him, something predatory. That night, the house was a symphony of terror. The strange noises were louder, more aggressive. I could hear muffled conversations, Eva and Jake's voices intertwining in a sinister melody. The words were indistinct, but the intent was clear. They were talking about me. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear. I knew I had to leave, but the thought of stepping out of my room, of facing Eva and Jake, was terrifying. The darkness of the house felt suffocating, the walls closing in on me. I realized then that I wasn't just a guest in this house. I was prey. The night was a canvas of shadows and fear, each creak of the house amplifying my anxiety. After overhearing the disturbing conversation between Eva and Jake, I knew I couldn't dismiss their presence as mere coincidence or harmless eccentricity. They were planning something sinister, and it involved me. My decision to stay, once rooted in necessity, now felt like a grave mistake. I lay in bed, my thoughts racing with scenarios of what they might do. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an impending sense of doom. I couldn't afford to let my guard down, not even for a moment. The trust I had in the safety of these walls had shattered, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. My mind replayed Eva's cryptic words and Jake's ominous presence. The pieces started to fall into place, forming a picture I couldn't deny. They weren't just random intruders. Their intentions were deliberate, targeted at me. As the hours ticked by, a new sound pierced the silence. A soft, deliberate footstep outside my room. My heart leaped to my throat. They were coming. This wasn't just paranoia. The danger was real and immediate. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. It was now or never. Moving quickly, I grabbed my phone and a few essentials, my actions fueled by adrenaline. I had to get out without alerting them, had to escape before their sinister plans unfolded. With every step towards the door, my anxiety peaked. I reached it, turning the handle slowly, painstakingly, to avoid any noise. The door opened to a dark, silent hallway. My heart was thunderous in the dead quiet of the house. I tiptoed through the hallway, hyper, aware of every sound, every shadow. Reaching the main door felt like an eternity. With trembling hands, I unlocked it, the click of the lock sounding deafening in my ears. As I opened the door, a chill of the night air hit me, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. I stepped out, and at that moment, a floorboard creaked loudly behind me. I didn't dare look back. I knew they were there, watching. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, away from the house, away from Eva and Jake, away from the nightmare that had ensnared me. The cold night air filled my lungs, but I didn't stop. Not until I was far enough to be safe, to be free from the grasp of that house and its sinister occupants. The night enveloped me, a lone figure fleeing from unseen horrors, from a terror that had lurked behind the facade of an ordinary Airbnb. Panting, my heart still racing from the flight, I found myself in the safety of a bustling, well-lit street. The normalcy of it all, the people walking by, chatting, laughing, seemed surreal after the nightmare I'd just escaped. I clutched my phone, fingers trembling, and dialed the police. The wait for them to arrive was agonizing. Every shadow seemed to whisper threats, and I kept glancing back towards the direction of the Airbnb, half, expecting to see Eva or Jake emerge from the darkness. When the police arrived, I recounted my story, my voice wavering with a mixture of fear and relief. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, but promised to check the house. I insisted on not going back, the memory of my harrowing escape still fresh and raw. They returned sooner than I expected, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. The house was completely empty. No sign of Eva or Jake, no evidence of anyone having been there except for my belongings scattered in my haste to leave. The Airbnb host was called, and his reaction only deepened the mystery. He was genuinely baffled, insisting that the house had been rented to me alone, and that he had no knowledge of any Eva or Jake. The police suggested it might have been a break-in, but nothing was missing or out of place, except for the unsettling signs of someone else's presence I had noticed upon arrival. In the following days, I grappled with a torrent of emotions. Fear, confusion, disbelief. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of them. Had Eva and Jake been real? Or had I stumbled into some elaborate, twisted game? I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. Every shadow, every unfamiliar face in the crowd made my heart skip a beat. The experience had left a scar, a deep-seated paranoia that refused to fade. The Airbnb was thoroughly investigated, but no further evidence was found. No fingerprints, no forgotten items, nothing to prove that Eva and Jake had ever been there. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the scattered remnants of their presence and the haunting memory of my encounter with them. I moved on eventually, but the experience lingered in the back of my mind. A dark, unresolved mystery. The questions remained unanswered, the fear unassuaged. What had their intentions been? Why me? But some questions are better left unasked. Some mysteries better left unsolved. For in the search for answers, one might just find themselves spiraling back into the shadows, back into the terror of that night. And that is a journey I am not willing to take. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. My friend Jake and I were headed to a wedding in rural Minnesota, and rather than opting for a hotel, we decided to try out an Airbnb. "It'll be an adventure," Jake had said when we booked the place. Little did we know how true those words would become. We arrived at the farmhouse just as dusk was setting in. The sky was painted with hues of orange and purple, but dark clouds loomed on the horizon, hinting at the approaching storm. The Airbnb was more secluded than we had expected, nestled amidst sprawling fields and dense woods. It was quaint, a picture, perfect postcard of rural charm, with its weathered wooden siding and a wraparound porch. As we unloaded our bags, the first rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, sending a shiver down my spine. Jake, ever the optimist, just laughed it off. "Adds to the ambience, doesn't it?" he joked. We spent the evening unpacking and preparing for the wedding the next day. The house, though charming, had an air of neglect about it. The floors creaked with every step, and the wind whistled through cracks in the windows. Nightfall brought an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional distant thunder. We sat on the porch, watching the lightning dance across the sky. "Creepy, isn't it?" Jake mused, but his tone was light, unbothered. I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease, though. There was something about the isolation of the farmhouse, the way the shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, that put me on edge. We decided to call it a night early, wanting to be fresh for the wedding. As I lay in bed, listening to the increasing intensity of the storm outside, I couldn't help but feel like we were not alone. The house groaned and sighed as if it were alive. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, a faint knocking sound caught my attention. It seemed to be coming from downstairs. I lay there, frozen, straining my ears to hear it again. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the distant rumbling of thunder. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe some animal outside. Yet, sleep didn't come easily that night. I had the unsettling feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking in the darkness. As the thunderstorm raged outside, I couldn't shake off the feeling that this weekend was going to be anything but ordinary. The wedding had been a blur of laughter, dancing, and too much champagne. By the time Jake and I returned to the farmhouse, the sky had turned an ominous shade of black, and the wind howled like a beast in agony. We stumbled inside, our heads spinning not just from the alcohol, but also from the uncanny darkness that enveloped the house. I remember collapsing into bed, the world spinning around me. But sleep, which should have come easy, eluded me. I tossed and turned, a sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. The storm outside raged on, thunder cracking so loud it felt like the sky was splitting open. It must have been past midnight when I first heard it, a faint knocking. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a trick of my intoxicated mind. But then it came again, clearer this time, a steady tap-tap, tapping like someone gently rapping at the window. I lay there, frozen, every nerve in my body screaming to stay put. But curiosity, or maybe it was fear, got the better of me. I crept out of bed, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The house was pitch black, the power evidently knocked out by the storm. I fumbled for my phone, using it as a makeshift torch, and made my way towards the sound. The knocking grew louder as I approached the living room. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear over its thuds. I reached the window, the source of the sound, and braced myself. With a trembling hand, I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. There was nothing there but the storm. Ravaged night, branches swaying wildly in the wind. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, though my voice lacked conviction. I stood there for a moment longer, staring into the darkness, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. When I returned to bed, Jake was snoring softly, oblivious to the night's disturbances. I envied his ignorance. I lay awake, listening to the storm, to the house settling, to the distant, unexplained noises that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The knocking didn't return that night, but something inside me had shifted. The quaint charm of the farmhouse now felt oppressive, like we were trapped in the belly of some slumbering beast. And as I finally drifted off to sleep, a part of me feared what the morning light might reveal. The morning after the wedding, I woke up to a gray, stormy day. The thunderstorm had not let up, and the farmhouse felt even more isolated in the daylight. I found Jake in the kitchen, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he poured himself a coffee. "He was there, outside the window," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. I paused, the memory of last night's knocking fresh in my mind. "Who was?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "A man," Jake replied, looking out the window into the rain, soaked fields. Just standing there, staring. When I blinked, he was gone. I wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the trees, but the fear in Jake's eyes was real. We debated packing up and leaving, but the idea of driving in the storm seemed just as dangerous. We decided to stay, rationalizing that it was just our nerves getting the better of us. As the day progressed, the atmosphere in the farmhouse grew heavier. We heard creaks and groans from the old structure, but now they seemed more sinister. Several times, I caught a glimpse of something moving outside the window, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. The feeling of being watched was constant. We tried to distract ourselves with games and books, but the sense of unease lingered. To make matters worse, we discovered that our cell phones had no service, and the farmhouse's internet was down, leaving us cut off from the outside world. As evening approached, the storm intensified. The thunder was deafening, shaking the very walls of the farmhouse. It was during one of these thunderclaps that we heard it, a distinct sound of footsteps upstairs. We froze, looking at each other in silent horror. There was no mistaking it. Someone or something was moving above us. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find, a frying pan for me, a fireplace poker for Jake, and crept towards the stairs. Every step creaked under our weight, betraying our movement. As we reached the top, footsteps stopped. We moved from room to room, finding nothing but the unsettling emptiness. Just when we thought it might have been our imagination, a loud bang came from downstairs. We rushed down to find the back door swinging open, the wind howling through it. Rain poured into the kitchen, but there was no sign of anyone. That night, we barricaded ourselves in one of the bedrooms, pushing a dresser against the door. The sounds continued. Footsteps, knocking, and the occasional glimpse of a shadow passing under the door. We stayed awake, clutching our makeshift weapons, jumping at every sound, waiting for the dawn. The storm outside mirrored the chaos in our minds, an unending torrent of fear and confusion. As the night dragged on, one thing became clear. We were not alone in that farmhouse. The night was relentless, and so was our fear. Jake and I barely spoke, our eyes fixed on the bedroom door, our ears straining to pick up any sound over the storm's cacophony. The thunder seemed to be right above us, each boom shaking the farmhouse as if it were trying to rip it from its foundations. It was during one particularly loud thunderclap that we heard it, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal. We exchanged a look of terror. Someone was picking the lock on the front door. The reality of our situation sunk in. We were not just spooked by an old house or a storm. We were in real danger. I fumbled with my phone, the battery dangerously low. With shaky hands, I dialed 911, praying for a signal. Miraculously, the call went through. I whispered our location and situation, hearing the dispatcher's voice crackle through the speaker, promising that help was on the way. But deep down, I knew the truth. The storm had made the roads nearly impassable. We were on our own. The door downstairs creaked open. We could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, making their way through the house. Each step was a hammer blow to our frayed nerves. We pushed the dresser harder against the bedroom door, but it felt futile. The intruder was coming for us. Then, the unthinkable happened. The door started to give way under the intruder's force. Jake and I grabbed whatever we could, chairs, a lamp, anything to defend ourselves. The door burst open, and there he was, a man, drenched from the storm, his eyes wild and unfocused. What happened next was a blur of adrenaline and terror. We fought with a desperation I never knew I had. There were shouts, the sound of breaking glass, the feeling of fists and feet colliding. Through it all, the thunder roared, as if cheering on the violence. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The intruder lay motionless on the floor. We didn't wait to see if he was alive or dead. We bolted from the room, down the stairs, and out into the storm. We didn't stop running until we saw the flashing lights of the police cars. The officers found us, soaked and shivering, a mile down the road. They took us back to the farmhouse, where they discovered the intruder had vanished. No trace of him remained, not even the blood we were sure should have been there. In the days that followed, Jake and I spoke little of what happened. The experience had bound us in a way that words couldn't express. We left Minnesota with a story that no one would believe, a story that would haunt our dreams for years to come. As I write this, the sound of thunder still sends a chill down my spine. It reminds me of that night, of the fear, the fight, and the feeling of being preyed upon. Some might say it was just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I know better. That farmhouse wasn't just a building. It was a trap, and we were the bait. And somewhere out there, the man who said it is still waiting, perhaps for the next storm, the next unsuspecting guests. And when the thunder rolls in, echoing across the fields, he'll be ready to strike again. I pulled into the town well past midnight. The GPS had been my only companion for the last hour, guiding me through winding roads that seemed increasingly desolate. As the car's headlights cut through the darkness, they illuminated a town that looked like it had been forgotten by time. Buildings, some with peeling paint and boarded windows, lined the empty streets. Not a soul was in sight. I parked in front of the Airbnb, a quaint two-story house that stood out with its relatively well-kept facade. I remember thinking it was strange that a place so seemingly neglected could be listed online. The town had an eerie vibe, but I chalked it up to my late arrival and city-bred paranoia. As I retrieved my bag from the trunk, I glanced up and saw a light flickering in an upstairs window of the Airbnb. Must be a security measure, I muttered to myself. Or perhaps a previous guest had forgotten to turn it off. Either way, I was too tired to give it much thought. The key was under the mat, just as the host had instructed. The house creaked as I stepped inside, a sound that echoed in the hollow space. I flipped the switch near the door, and a dim light filled the entryway, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I locked the door behind me, a habit from living in the city. As I explored the ground floor, checking the kitchen and the small living area, everything seemed in order. Old, but well maintained. I found a note from the host on the kitchen table, welcoming me and providing the Wi-Fi password. Standard stuff. The eerie quiet of the town was more pronounced inside the house. Every step I took seemed to be amplified, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just the fatigue talking. Making my way upstairs, I intended to find my room, unpack, and get some much-needed sleep. My work assignment in this remote town was going to be challenging enough without starting on the back foot. Little did I know, sleep would be the last thing I'd find in this house. Exhausted from the journey, I trudged up the narrow staircase to the second floor. The Airbnb's quaint charm did little to ease the sense of isolation that crept over me. I chose a bedroom at the end of the hallway, its window overlooking the deserted street. The room was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, and I hurriedly unpacked my bag for a sweater. Lying in the creaky bed, I tried to focus on the work that brought me here, but the silence of the house was unsettling. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a rural night. It felt heavy, like a blanket, smothering all sound. It started with a thud from the attic above. The sudden noise in the dead silence jolted me upright. Rationalizing it as the house settling, I tried to calm my racing heart. But then came the creaking floorboards, like the weight of someone moving stealthily. I strained my ears, wondering if I was imagining things. The footsteps grew more distinct, moving along the hallway outside my room. My mind raced with thoughts of the light I'd seen earlier. Was someone else in the house? I remembered then stories I'd heard at the last town about this place. Whispers of its dubious reputation. Stories of tourists going missing, of locals shunning this particular Airbnb. I had dismissed them as small town gossip. But now, trapped in the reality of these sounds, they felt ominously relevant. I sat up, gripping the edge of the bed. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I held my breath. After a moment that felt like an eternity, they moved on, fading into the distance. I waited, listening, but they didn't return. With a shaky exhale, I got out of bed and moved cautiously to the door. My hand hovered over the knob, a debate raging in my mind. The rational part of me wanted to check, to confirm it was just my imagination. But fear rooted me to the spot. After a long moment, I turned away from the door, deciding against opening it. Instead, I pushed a chair under the doorknob. A meager barricade, but something. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in my stomach. The rest of the night was a blur of fitful sleep and startling awake at every small sound. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, it felt like a reprieve. But the fear of what the night had brought lingered, a foreboding shadow over what I had thought would be a simple work trip. Dawn's light brought little relief to my frayed nerves. The unsettling events of the night lingered in my mind, casting a shadow over the quaint room. I tried to convince myself it was all a product of my imagination, an overreaction to an unfamiliar place and the town's unsettling reputation. But as night fell again, my anxiety resurged. I double-checked the doors and windows, ensuring they were locked. The house was silent, almost oppressively so, as if waiting for something to shatter the calm. And it did. It started with a soft scratching at the front door, like someone was trying to pick the lock. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then, a sudden bang, as if someone had thrown their weight against the door. Panic surged through me. I rushed to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The noise outside intensified, transforming into a cacophony of angry shouts and violent thuds. I could hear the intruder's voice, warped with rage, hurling threats and curses. I fumbled with my phone, hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was a distant lifeline as I whispered my plight, the address spilling out in a frantic rush. The dispatcher's calm tone was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding outside my door. The banging on my bedroom door began, each strike a hammer blow to my sanity. The wood creaked and groaned under the assault, a terrifying symphony that drowned out the dispatcher's assurances. I backed away, stumbling over a chair, my eyes fixed on the door as it shuddered in its frame. The intruder's voice was relentless, a barrage of threats and fury. I couldn't understand why they were so intent on getting to me, a stranger in this forsaken town. It felt personal, as if the intruder's rage was fueled by more than just the desire to harm. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise ceased. The silence was deafening, a void filled with my ragged breaths and pounding heart. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, my gaze locked on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Minutes stretched like hours until the distant sound of sirens pierced the night. The police arrived, their presence surreal comfort in the aftermath of terror. They found no one, just the echoes of the night's horror etched into the battered door and my shaken soul. I learned later that the intruder had fled just before the police arrived, disappearing into the night like a ghost. The officers were sympathetic but not surprised. They spoke in hushed tones about similar incidents, a pattern of harassment that had plagued other tourists, tainting the town's reputation. As I sat in the back of the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, the terror of the night replayed in my mind. I had come to this town for work, unaware of the nightmare that awaited me. And now, as I looked at the old Airbnb house bathed in the flashing lights of police cars, I knew I would never forget the terror of being hunted in a stranger's home. The morning after the attack was surreal. The Airbnb, once a quaint and quiet refuge, now felt like a crime scene. Police officers moved through the house, their voices a low murmur as they documented the aftermath of the night's terror. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun rise over the town that had become my nightmare. The police chief, a stern but kind man, sat beside me, his presence both comforting and official. He explained that the intruder was known to them, a local with a grudge against outsiders. "He's part of the reason this town has such a bad reputation lately," the chief said, his voice tinged with regret. "We've been trying to catch him, but he's always one step ahead." The word reputation echoed in my mind. It was reputation that had led me to choose this Airbnb, its high ratings and charming description on the website. But those were a facade, masking the darker truth of this town, a truth that nearly cost me my life. I thought about the warning signs I ignored, the deserted streets, the flickering light in the window, the stories of the town's dubious past. It was a harsh lesson in trusting my instincts, in the reality that not all threats are as obvious as they seem. As I gave my statement to the police, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I had survived, but not unscathed. The terror of that night would stay with me, a haunting reminder of my vulnerability. The police offered to escort me out of town, but I declined. I needed to leave this place on my own terms, to reclaim some semblance of control. As I drove away from the Airbnb, I took one last look in the rearview mirror. The house, now just a speck in the distance, represented a chapter of my life I was eager to close. I made a silent vow then, a promise to myself. Never again would I stay in an Airbnb. Never again would I ignore the signs. This experience had changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of the shadows that lurk beneath the surface of seemingly idyllic places. As the town disappeared behind me, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that I was leaving it behind, and sorrow for those who might unknowingly walk into the same nightmare. My story was one of survival, but it was also a warning about the dangers that can hide behind a friendly facade, about the importance of reputation, and the reality that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones living right next door.